Chapter 10. The Residence of Dr. Raemond Morningstar, London, England, May 31st, 1889. Ray's sheets were soaked in sweat. At least, the sheets which hadn't been cast from the bed amidst the historian's tossing and turning, caught up in his wild thrashing against non-existent assailants. His clothes clung to his body as he writhed in fear and pain, still semi-conscious as his brain desperately dragged him kicking and screaming into reality, away from the nightmares which plagued his every moment of sleep. Was this what Athena had felt all these years? Suffering these endless nightmares and nocturnal terrors just a few doors down the hall? The thought of the child he had rescued so many years ago helped to pull Ray from the depths of this distant world of darkness. Athena's presence was a warmth radiating from the depths of a cold, empty void, filled with the whisperings and screeching of the shadowy demons that resided there, and the insistent voice of something else entirely. A voice which had invaded his mind and was feeding him thoughts which felt so unsettlingly like his own. Ray dragged himself from the bed, trembling violently as he desperately tore the bandages from his face, scratching at the scarred purple flesh beneath in a desperate attempt to be freed from the compression against his eye, which felt as if it burned inside his skull. Ray dropped to his knees as he made his way across the room, pulling himself shakily up on a chest of drawers and shuffling down the hall to the stairs. The building felt dark and empty without Jamie and Athena around to breathe life into it. The atmosphere reminded him too much of the realm these dreams insisted on dragging him to. No lamps were lit from peaceful late-night reading. No mugs of tea and hot cocoa were left to go cold on the desks beside open books and stacks of transcribed notes. The once messy desks in his assistant's office were neat and orderly in the vacant and artificial way that comes from an absence of activity. It was a mock study, a diorama in a museum, an abandoned theatre set. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, keeping as still as it could, waiting for the stench of illness to pass before it allowed life to continue as normal. It would be waiting a very long time. The historian continued in his half-awake journey, the strange voice still whispering in his mind as he forced his eyes to stay open, forced the infected eye to work in tandem with his healthy one, flooding his vision with strange green halos as he emerged into his office. It was a large, spacious area on the lowermost level of the house, a converted parlor room, in truth. Ornate tables and bookshelves filled much of the space, supporting stacks of open books and large glass display cases filled with ancient artifacts and archaeological curiosities. None of the contents mattered to Ray anymore, however, if it could be said that Ray was even the one in control of his mind. Ray felt as if part of him had simply fallen away into the darkness of the void, and something else was guiding him as he continued to slip into the fog. All that mattered to him now was not the objects, but the space. Raemond Morningstar was not a large man. His body was far better suited to his academic lifestyle, but years of sorting archival boxes had inlaid in such a strength within his frame that even now in his weakened state, it took surprisingly little effort to drag the furniture and decor from its original positions. Paintings and mounted displays were cast from the walls and desks were dragged into the halls, leaving deep scratches and trails across the polished wooden floor. Ray had already filled his remaining notebooks over the last few days whilst in this same feverish state, and now, desperate for space to write, he found his fingers tightly gripping charcoal and chalk as he scrawled aggressively on the walls. It was as if the voices in his mind were pouring a liquid volume of information into his brain, and the only way to make room for more, to stop himself going completely mad from the building pressure of these strange words, was to let it spill out, to expel it in the form of incoherent words and sigils, making room for more. Little of it made sense to him, even as it spewed forth from his mind and was transferred by his hand. Ray was caught in a trance, asleep to his movements and yet fully awake in his mind, simply letting the voices guide him, letting his infected eye guide him. The burning pain increased behind the socket, and, unbeknownst to Ray, the green eye began to glow brighter in the darkness. Ray knew this was all something important, something he felt deep down he had always been looking for, had perhaps always known, the culmination of all these years studying an ancient society that his academic peers refused to acknowledge. As the glyphs filled the floor, spiraling around him now, and the notes spread from wall to wall, floor to ceiling, Ray felt the fatigue begin to overcome his body. He was mortal, after all, even if the force controlling him was not. Through the small windows on the furthest wall from the door, the sun, now well beyond its highest point, poured into the empty room. As the mania wore away, Ray collapsed to his knees in the center of the room, his hands scraped and bruised and bloodied from hours of writing. The screaming of the voices drifted off into silence as both clarity and exhaustion washed over him, the effects of time taking their toll. His charcoal-coated and ruined fingers twitched involuntarily as he flopped sideways onto the ground, shuddering violently. His stomach churned and Ray began to heave, desperate to cast out whatever his body was rejecting, as if the reflex could purge his system from the mold which burrowed into his skin. Having eaten nothing in the days since his return from Arboreal Manor, however, his body had nothing to expel. He simply continued retching on the floor, his throat burning and dry, the otherworldly screams replaced instead by his body's own pained sobs. Maybe if he stayed like this, it would go away, he thought distantly. Maybe the information would fade from the walls in the sunlight, and his own body would sink into the floor as if it were nothing but water, trickling away from this agonizing hell. Maybe he could finally sleep if he just let it pass. "Ray?" Athena's voice broke as she forced her way through the mountain of furniture blockading the door to the office. Ray couldn't force himself to offer any kind of response, merely whimpering in a vague approximation of his nephew's name. He hadn't heard the door open over the sound of his own heart beating in his ears and the sobs which racked his body. For a long time he could barely even make out Athena's form, his eyes only registering a burning mass of red light, harsh against the green aura of the room. "Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god," Athena mumbled over and over, struggling desperately to move a bookcase out of their way. The shelves suddenly flew into the wall at their touch, slamming into the plaster and embedding itself with little effort. Neither of the two noticed. Vaulting himself over the desk into the room, Athena dropped to the ground beside his uncle, his hands hovering inches over Ray's trembling frame, afraid that if he touched him it would only cause more pain, or that somehow Ray was so fragile that he would wither away to ash and dust at the first sign of contact. "Ray, listen to me. Everything's gonna be okay. Shit, Ray, I don't..." Athena sobbed, slipping an arm under Ray's side and managing to sit the historian upright, pulling their uncle into a hug and trying to hold him steady. Athena's tears soaked into Ray's already sweat-drenched shirt. "Please, Ray. It hurts." Ray couldn't bring himself to feel embarrassment, simply falling into Athena's embrace and muttering again, more to himself than his rescuer. "It hurts." It was barely more than a whisper, each syllable lacing a heavy breath. I want it to stop hurting," he sobbed finally, feeling his body shake. He was aware of how childish the statement was, but at this moment he didn't care. He was just glad somebody was there to hear the words. He was glad he wasn't alone. I know, Ray, I know." Athena could feel Ray's tears beginning to soak through her collar as she pulled her mentor closer. "We'll find a way, I promise. We'll make it stop hurting." The pair stayed like that for a long time, propped against each other on the floor. Child and adult, mentor and assistant, uncle and nephew. That was what they referred to themselves as. Athena did not know if he had picked the habit up from Jamie, or if Jamie had picked it up from him. It didn't matter, of course. In the same way it didn't matter that Ray was not really their uncle, and they were not really his nephews. They were family, the three of them, and that was simply that. As far as Athena was aware, they were the only family he had ever truly known. The only family she had been given. And it was a family which he was trying so desperately to hold in his hands, terrified it would slip between his fingers like dust in the wind. When Ray's breathing finally settled, and his shaking melted to a slight quiver, Athena sat back a little from the embrace. Her brown eyes drifted around the room, noticing for the first time the insane ramblings on the walls. "Ray, what have you done?" What language is this? He asked quietly. Ray tried to pull himself together between sobs. He tried to be the mentor and the guardian he was supposed to be, and to have an answer. Opening his good eye long enough to look at the walls, he tried to refrain from gagging long enough to speak. I don't know, he mumbled. It looks like fragments of writing from Athens, maybe? I think it looks familiar, but I don't know what it means. I don't know how I wrote that. I don't know. Athena shivered. Her eyes slid over the foreign words, reading them as easily as if they were the Queen's English, much of which also filled the walls in unintelligible chunks. Being able to read the language did little to make the writings make sense, however. Much of it was garbled fragments of myths and stories Athena had never heard, places Ray had investigated, measurements for unspecified objects, materials with no correlation, names which meant nothing, but felt as though they should mean everything. Illyrian, Andarian, Nethrum, Fable. Athena shivered again. That name meant something, at least. The Fable Society. Although its presence among these strange words made Athena's stomach churn. We need to get you back to bed. We need to get you food or water or something. No, I can't. I have to... Ray swallowed. His tongue was dry and the inside of his mouth felt coated with a sickly, disgusting film. I have to figure out what this means. Ray's voice broke. Athena tried to stand up, pulling Ray with them. They utterly failed in this attempt. Where was Jamie when they needed him in situations like this? They were at least strong enough to lift Ray out of the room. The other youth had been staying in their own home for a few days now, since the meeting at the Fable Society, but he was supposed to have returned to London this morning. Athena pushed aside the thought. As it was, Dr. Morningstar was going nowhere until he decided to, and Athena had learned over many years that there was little that could be done to combat his uncle's stubbornness. All right, Doc. You can stay in this room, but only while I find you some water. Athena placed a hand on Ray's forehead. God, you're burning up, Athena forced a laugh, although there was nothing humorous about the situation. Just stay alive for me, okay? Please. Ray nodded, squeezing close to Athena for a moment before sliding off of them, allowing them to prop him against a wall. Thank you, he muttered. Thank you. Thank me when you're better. All right, Ray? Athena smiled softly, pushing himself to his feet and scrambling back over the table into the hall. She paused for a moment, noticing the bookshelf she had thrown so easily into the wall, and then kept going on her way. Athena managed to push aside the desk with their hip on their return to the room, their knuckles white around the edges of a tray laden with supplies. Here, let me rebandage your... No. Ray shook his head, cutting them off. He'd managed to pull himself together a little more in the time Athena had been gone, but he was still clearly shaken by the event, and the sudden movement made him feel as though he was about to retch again. No, I'll only tear it off again. Athena put down the bandages. Then at least let me plaster the cuts you've given yourself by pulling it off. Athena took a wet cloth and dabbed away some of the discolored blood, which Ray hadn't realized had dried against his skin. He simply nodded and allowed his nephew to patch him up, his eyes, both normal and infected, scanning the walls. I was wrong, Ray said after a long while. Athena sat back, pouring Ray a strong cup of tea, and setting it aside to cool as they instead offered him a glass of water, which the historian took, cradling it in his quivering hands. Wrong about what? It wasn't a society, Ray said, sipping the water and letting it wash over his mouth, soothing the burning in his throat. Not in the way I thought it was. It wasn't an ethnicity or a civilization. I think it was a religion. Athena scanned the walls. I don't understand. How does that... Ray raised a weak arm to point at the writings. We haven't been searching for a singular group of people, Athena. It was never a singular group. It was several, maybe even dozens of separate sects spread out across cultures. Cults within a wider religion. But they're all disconnected. It predates contact between groups and even some other religions. It predates everything. Athena, this changes the way we see human beings, changes the way we evolved as a global society, as a species. Athena felt the truth catch in their throat. Doc, Ray, you're not well. You don't need me to tell you that. Maybe it's a legitimate theory, but you always taught me to look at the evidence, but this is the evidence right here, Ray insisted, spilling some of his water onto the floor. This is what they told me. Who told you, Ray? Dreams? Voices? Listen to what you're saying. This? Athena asked, looking around sadly. Ray, this is incoherent scribblings, written by a fevered, riddled man, in the throes of an infection. This is speculation at best, fiction in reality, and madness at its worst. You need to let this infection pass. Then, maybe, we can look into this religion theory. Even as Athena spoke, he felt doubt creep into his mind. What if Ray was right, after all? Maybe it was a religion. And if it was, why did it all seem so familiar? Those names on the wall. And what if it doesn't? Ray asked quietly. What if the infection doesn't pass? It will. I Ray shouted as pain rocketed through his eye. The historian threw his weight forward, forcing his unresponsive body to move as he gripped Athena's shoulders, the retching, grinding humming in his mind rising once again. Athena, please, if I don't make it through this, you need to follow through with this research, follow through with this theory. Your aura is... Jamie can help, but they're still green, and you're red. You're different. You can find out what this means. You need to... Ray registered for the first time the look of genuine fear in Athena's eyes as he grasped them. The sight of it dulled the screaming, and Ray's voice wavered. You need to... Ray, please, Athena grunted. Please, let go. Ray fell back, releasing their nephew's arms, his fingers aching from gripping them so tightly. I'm sorry, Ray said, his voice breaking. He could feel tears in the corner of his good eye again, and he wondered if, despite the lack of feeling there, the infected eye was crying too. I'm sorry, Athena, I didn't mean... Athena had already stood up and was moving out of the room, tears prickling in the corners of his eyes. Don't... Please, Ray, just don't... Not right now. I know it's not you, Ray, but I'll be back, I promise. I can't do this alone. Athena pushed past more furniture. I'm late for an appointment with Dr. Taurus. I promised to meet with him now that we're back in London. Maybe you should talk to him too, when you're better. I'm sorry, I can't do this, Ray. Athena was out the door before she could even pull her coat on. Once again, Ray was left in the empty house by himself, with only the guilt of hurting the child he had raised and cared for to keep him company. He was scaring those closest to him, and he was scaring himself even more so. What was he doing? He thought, until an even worse question presented itself. What was he going to do?